Hi there, I'm Tommy Carbone, Maine author and regional explorer. And today, on My Maine Matters, we're going to talk about lobsters. You know, you can get bargains on lobsters at those quaint lobster shacks all the way from Kittery up the coast to Quoddy Head. Now, I'm just kidding. You're not going to find any bargains on lobsters at those places. But we are going to talk about lobsters. And we're here today at Lobster Lake in Lobster Township, northeast of Moosehead Lake. And there's some history of lobsters on this lake, or at least with at least one story on how the lake got named. If you like my Moosehead episode, which you can watch right here after this episode, I'll put the links in the description. The naming of Lobster Lake has had a lot of misnomers and false narratives over the years. And you might even find on a website or two that it's named because it's shaped like the shape of a lobster claw. Not really so. So stay tuned. We'll get into that. Come on, let's go explore. Today on My Maine Matters, we're headed northeast of Moosehead Lake to Lobster Township. As it was with the misconception that Moosehead Lake was named for its drawn outline looking like a moose's antlered head, the naming of Lobster Lake also has a serendipitous English naming related to its final drawn shape. However, we must examine the early maps and the stories to find out the true origin of the lake's name. Hubbard's 1899 map is good, but is not totally accurate for the current outline of the shorelines. The peninsula shown is represented as it was in the late 1800s. It may have been a peninsula based upon water levels at the time. Now it's an island. For a long time, it was known as Big Island. Big Island has been renamed Leadbetter Island. In 2012, the Leadbetter family, who owns several plots on the lake with connections to the region going back more than 150 years, deeded Big Island in a conservation easement to the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. As far as the township naming, T3R14 Wells means Township 3, Range 14, Wells being west of the easterly line. If you also look closely at the Maine Township map, you'll see triangular or pie-shaped townships. Those are gores, like Misery Gore, which is north of Misery Gore Township. We'll be talking more about Misery Gore in an upcoming episode, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. An interesting fact about Lobster Lake is that it is what we call a pocket lake. Based upon the lake's level, sometimes water flows northward into the west branch of the Penobscot River, and sometimes water from the west branch flows into Lobster Lake. If you paddle Lobster Lake stream, you'll certainly notice at times of the year that the river flows in opposite directions. Well, one poor Green River driver didn't realize this. He was sent ahead to go down the drive and boom off the lobster stream so that the logs coming down from Seboomook would continue down the west branch and on to Chesuncook Lake. Well, he saw that current and he ended up booming off the main branch of the Penobscot River. So when the logs came down, they floated up into Lobster Lake. Well, I'll let you imagine the words the lumberman boss had for that river driver when they had to warp and boom all those logs back out of Lobster Lake and up to the west branch. There's some other interesting history on Lobster Lake related to sporting camps. In the Lobster Lake Bandits Mystery at Moosehead, I drew a picture of a cabin that represented the cabin belonging to the Parker family. That, of course, was fictional. But in Bill Geller's book, West of Chesuncook and North of Moosehead, Log Drives and Sporting Camps, Bill includes a wicked cool number of pictures of the old sporting camps and family compounds that resided along Lobster Lake way back in time to the current day. A well-known family were the Leadbetters. On Hubbard's map, along the North Branch, he labels a place called Leadbetter Falls. They were well-known Penobscot lumbermen, highly skilled at rafting, and they brought some of the biggest pines down the river. The Leadbetters also logged up north of Chamberlain, and there's Leadbetter Pond and Little Leadbetter Pond up that way. You might recall the Telos War, where they ran a canal to Telos Lake. The river drivers then had to pay a fee in order to run their logs that way. The only holdout was a Leadbetter. He refused to pay the fee and left his logs right in the Telos thoroughfare. The Leadbetter name was so famous in lumbermen and logging circles that Maine author Holman wrote a book called Leadbetter's Luck. I've recently issued the Maine Classic Annotated edition of this wonderful story. You can find it at TommyCarbone.com. And Lobster Lake has quite a bit of logging history as well. Lobster Mountains were logged by John Ross. John Ross had his farm, his lumberman supply depot, Ross's Farm, a mile or two south of northeast Cary on the east side of Moosehead Lake. He had a tote road that went across to the base of Lobster Mountain. Long after Ross, people were still running pulpwood down Lobster Mountain. This picture from the Northern in 1922 shows the old sluiceway that came down along the mountain. The periodical reported that there was a forest fire on Lobster Mountain, and a lot of the sluiceway was damaged in 1922. Now over on Chesuncook, the John Ross Dam, as it was known, was used to hold the head of water to drive the logs down the West Branch. That, of course, was well before the Rip Dam over on Ripogenis Gorge. You can hear about that in the Rip Dam episode. For more on John Ross, you can read the Penobscot Man, Life and Death on a Maine River. That annotated edition not only has stories about Ross and his interactions with Fannie Hardy Eckstorm, but there's also a great ballad written about Ross and his legend as a Maine lumberman. Back in the day, to reach Lobster Lake, a lot of people took a steamer up Moosehead Lake to northeast Cary. Here you can see the wharf. If you've ever been up to that part of Moosehead, you know it's very shallow, so the wharf extended hundreds of feet out into the lake. They would then go across the northeast Cary Road either by wagon or carrying their canoes or toting their baggage to get to the West Branch, and from there they'd go down Lobster Stream into Lobster Lake. Back when, the tote roads were used with horses to take baggage and canoes across the Cary. When you get to Lobster Stream, it is probably one of the prettiest streams in Maine to go for a paddle. At the outlet of the stream into the lake, you get a great view of Katahdin. And coming around the bend, you'll see Sabatawan, or the Pack, part of the Moose Hills. The shoreline is very characteristic, and in fact, what you find there has to do with how Lobster Stream and Lobster Lake were given their English names. The earliest clues, documented anyhow, on how Lobster Stream and Lobster Lake got their names come from Henry David Thoreau. When he took his trip to Chesuncook, guided by Joe Attean, he said, "After paddling about 2 miles, we parted company with the explorers and turned up Lobster Stream." Joe said that it was so called from small freshwater lobsters found in it. It is Mattahumkeag of the maps. When Thoreau returned in 1857 to take his Allagash and East Branch trip, he noted, "When we had gone about 3 miles down the Penobscot, we looked out for a camping place. Not far below the mouth of what Joe Attean in '53 called Lobster Stream, coming from Lobster Pond. At this time he was guided by Joe Polis, and he said, our present Indian, however, did not admit this name, nor even that of Mattahumkeag, but called the lake Beskabaguk. So what causes this confusion between the names? Well, in 1820 on Moses Greenleaf's map, he has it labeled as Lobster Pond. Now, you might see some shape there related to a lobster claw in that blob, but probably not. So it was probably given that English name because of the freshwater lobsters. Sidney Morse had no label, but it certainly doesn't look like a lobster claw. In 1844, Greenleaf updated his map, and he has a much more detailed outline of the lake, but it's not representative of Big Island or what the lake actually turned out to look like. But you can see on Hubbard's map, he labels it as Lobster Lake or Pesce Begot. Between the writings of Hubbard and Thoreau, and of course Fannie Hardy Eckstorm, Maine's wonderful historian, naturalist, ornithologist, writer, and educator, we can come to the conclusion about how Lobster Lake went from its Indian name, a Pesce Begot, to Lobster Lake. But first is another controversy. Fannie Hardy Eckstorm, in 1931, she made this comment. In the June Harper's Magazine, in an article by Brendan Lee, the writer makes a statement for which a due correction should be speedily recorded. He says the brook flows northward through unbroken forest to Sagargamuk, a picturesque Indian name which by some linguistic lunacy has been translated into Lobster Lake. The point to insist upon is that there is no such Indian name, Sagargamuk, for Lobster Lake or for any other Maine lake that we know of. Lobster Lake is an original English name and not a translation of any Indian name for the lake. She concluded, there is a good reason for the name, which should not be changed by theorists or strangers. She says Lobster Lake was so called from the tiny freshwater lobsters which are, or used to be, found there in numbers. I have never seen them described in any book, but I have seen and handled the tiny creatures which escape general observation. When she was on a trip with her father, Manly Hardy, he pulled out some crayfish, crawfish for her, and she noted, although he was not more than 2 inches long, he could nip sharply and took the aggressive. In all his motions, he was precisely like the large lobster. I know that Lobster Lake got its name from these little fellows. As to the original Native American names for the lake, Lucius Hubbard has to be consulted for the reasons behind those derivations. And of course, Hubbard on his maps labeled the lake Pesce Begot. And in letters to Fannie Hardy Eckstorm, he told her it most likely meant a branching lake or a dead water. And so there may have been some confusion between the stream itself, which is more like a dead water sometimes, and the lake, which was a split lake. He noted the Indian name for Lobster Lake was Pesce Begot, and that was on his map from his earliest versions. And while Joe Polis pronounced it with a B, that is basically the same word. Hubbard came up with 2 derivations of Pesce Begot. Begot is a word for dead water in Abenaki, and pesce, or pisca, as we get in Piscataqua or Piscataquis, indicates a branching. So Hubbard suggested that meant a split lake, probably because of the island there. Or also because conditions varied based upon the outlet into the West Branch, where it was almost like a dead water, and depending upon the time of year you paddle there, you may not get much of a current in that stream. You can read Eckstorm's full essay on Lobster Lake in Exploring the Maine Woods, the Hardy Family Expedition to the Machias Lakes. Also available is Hubbard's Woods and Lakes of Maine, the annotated edition. Eckstorm wrote a lot about the river drivers, and she wrote a lot of unpublished stories which are now available in Fannie Hardy Eckstorm, short stories and essays. So Eckstorm gave her opinion on the writer Brendan Lee and his name for Lobster Lake. Certainly he was wrong. There's been no other evidence for that name, for it to be on a map anywhere. So now you know the reason behind how Lobster Lake got its English name. For a great fictional story, pick up a copy of the Lobster Lake Bandits Mystery at Moosehead. But if you want to have a lobster bake up at Lobster Lake, be sure to bring your own lobsters.